Today on the Overlooked Motel, we are fondly recalling an underseen single-location comedic thriller from the early 80s that doesn't get enough love. I'm talking about Sidney Lumet's Deathtrap. Deathtrap is a macabre thriller with a winding narrative that is rarely predictable and endlessly amusing. The core cast serves up quirky, memorable showings that will result in a mixture of chills and chuckles. Don't sleep on this twisty effort. This unpredictable dark comedy unfolds as follows. Sidney Bruhl is a legendary playwright whose best years are far behind him. His last 4 plays have bombed, and he's currently living off his ultra-wealthy wife Myra's laurels. When Clifford, a former student from a seminar Sidney once taught, reaches out asking the celebrated playwright to look over his script, Sidney cannot believe his eyes. The writing is nothing short of brilliant. Sidney begins to make macabre jokes with Myra about offing Clifford and releasing the play as his own prior to inviting Clifford over to discuss a possible collaboration. Before long, Sidney, Myra, and Clifford find themselves embroiled in a series of macabre mishaps. Who will live to tell the tale? And will the play ever see the light of day? You'll have to watch Deathtrap and find out for yourself. Deathtrap has an impressive pedigree. The film is adapted from an Ira Levin play of the same name. Levin is surely familiar to horror fans as the author of the iconic novel Rosemary's Baby. Screenwriter J. Preston Allen adapts the proceedings effectively for the silver screen. The primarily single-location setup sees a sense of isolation setting in quickly. That suits the storyline rather well. As the narrative becomes more unhinged, it starts to feel as if the walls are closing in. By the time the credits roll, you're likely to feel a sense of cabin fever setting in. Actually, the cabin fever is likely to set in before the day now may. This is a film that hinges upon a twist. Actually, the film hinges on a series of twists. The plot winds and circles back numerous times throughout the feature's runtime, making for a jarring and intense viewing experience. It's rarely clear where any of the characters' true loyalties lie. Each character has their own agenda. The narrative builds to a finale that is more than a little unexpected, yet perfectly befitting to the quirky narrative it accompanies. The final twist is both dark and comical. That's apropos, considering I've used variations of both words throughout this critique. Some films that hinge on a twist render a rewatch cumbersome. That's not the case with Deathtrap. Knowing where the narrative is headed allows the informed viewer to more easily see how effectively the twists are supported by the narrative in which they are embedded. Some films that hinge on a twist render a rewatch pointless. That's not the case with Deathtrap. Knowing where the narrative is headed allows the informed viewer to more easily see how effectively the twists are supported by the narrative in which they are embedded. The previously inducted have the luxury of looking for well-disguised clues that support the eventual surprises in store. We covered Deathtrap in the book I co-edited, Queer Horror: A Film Guide. I'd love to discuss that in greater detail here, however, that would be a disservice to you. In order to explain why the film warrants inclusion in the book requires additional context on several narrative twists that I have no desire to spoil. I can say, however, that I think the film's queer elements kept it from breaking out at the time of release and likely influenced some of the critiques that skewed negatively. Thankfully, we live in a more enlightened time now. The Golden Raspberry Awards nominated Dyan Cannon for Worst Actress, which seems harsh and misguided, almost as if the nominating committee completely misunderstood the difference between deliberately hamming it up and bad acting. Cannon is written as over-the-top and larger than life. She's merely playing the character as directed. Her turn as Myra is comical. She adds a quirky flair that works well with the feature's decidedly campy tone. I chuckle every time she screams bloody murder when startled by even the most innocuous noise. Myra provides comic relief while bringing a quirky charm to the setup. It's hard to say why the Razzies singled out Cannon. Myra is far from the only eccentric character here. Irene Worth is almost as over the top in her turn as nosy psychic Helga Tendorp. Helga barges into the Bruhl home on a number of different occasions, convinced that something nefarious is afoot. Helga cuts the tension with comedic asides while simultaneously creating a sense of unease with her inability to mind her own business. Christopher Reeve as Clifford and Michael Caine as Sidney are slightly more grounded than their co-stars, providing a nice counterbalance to keep the proceedings tethered. Watching their dynamic play out is really engaging. They play remarkably well off of one another. You'll see what I mean when you watch the film. In spite of a handful of negative reviews, lackluster box office performance, and an undeserved Razzie nom, the flick remains well regarded by those who have seen it. In fact, the film has a respectable critical approval rating of 74% on Rotten Tomatoes. The audience score is almost as favorable at 70%. If I've successfully piqued your curiosity and you'd like to check out the film, you can catch Deathtrap streaming via Plex as of the publication of this video. The flick is also available on DVD and Blu-ray. For the maximum benefit, make sure to watch Deathtrap late at night with all the lights out. That's all for this installment of the Overlooked Motel. If you'd like to chat more about underseen and underrated films, feel free to hit me up with your thoughts on Twitter, Threads, or Instagram @FunWithHorror.